We're on Daf Samach Dalid, and we're back approximately two-thirds into the Mishnah, and we're up to Kimaseu B'chol. That's what we got up to yesterday. And that, if you count from the bottom of the Amud, you will count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up. So the last thing that we discussed, just to refresh my memory and maybe yours as well, is the Kriyas HaHalel issue, because we found it very strange that Rabbi Yehuda says that on the third round of the 3 Kitos, they never got a chance to finish Hallel. They would stop midway at the pasuk of Ki Ahavti, because there were very few people in the third kat, and before you know it, Ahavti Ki Yishma Hashem Es Koli, they were ready to pack out of the Azor. They had finished all the avoda, and there's a whole discussion here about breaking Hallel in the middle. And basically the issue fluctuates or revolves around whether or not they made a bracha on Hallel during Shchitas HaPesach. Many of the Achronim assume that, like any other Hallel, there's a mitzvah of Kriya and you recite a bracha. How can you terminate the Hallel midway? And they come up with various answers. Maybe the Yisraelim would still linger on to finish up the Hallel, or maybe the Levi would continue the Hallel even after Yisraelim packed out of the Azara. But what's common to all these Achronim is to try to justify how they would have finished the Hallel, despite what Rabbi Yehuda seems to be saying at the face of it, that Lo Higiu Le'ahavti Ki Yishma. The Brisker Rav, on the other hand, was of the opinion that there was no bracha on the Hallel on the Korban Pesach. And he divides up Hallel into 2 fundamentally different categories. One is called Hallel Shel Kriya, and the other is called Hallel Shel Shira. And this is all based on the Gaonim, who are of the opinion that there's such a thing as Hallel Shel Shira, and that's the Hallel at the time of the Avos HaKorban, because there's no separate Machayev here in the categories that we know of with regard to Hallel. And those categories are 3. Number 1, Moed. Now we're talking on Erev Pesach, so there's no Machayev of Moed. Number 2, Nes, a miracle. There's no miracle, so why are we saying Hallel? And number 3, we have what's called Hallel Shel Pirsum, which applies on the night of Pesach at the Seder, and there, as part of the Nusa Vigada to Lebincha, Chayv Adam Lirasis Atzmo, Kilu Yotzim Mitzrayim, we gather together and we recite Hallel in the Beis HaKnesses as a tzibur, and for sure we're going to make a bracha on that Hallel. I know many of you are thinking, we don't do that in my shul, because I daven in a Nusach Ashkenaz shul. But as a general rule, most of Klal Yisrael, I hate to say it, are reciting Hallel on Leil HaPesach in the Beis HaKnesses and with a bracha. But this Hallel that we're talking about here in our Mishnah is a unique Hallel. It's almost like a spontaneous outburst of song and praise to express gratitude to Hashem for giving us the opportunity of celebrating Pesach with the Korban HaPesach. And we recite Hallel, but not B'Torah's Kriya, but B'Torah's Shira. And if it's something that's spontaneous, it means to flow as a song from the heart and not a formal, breakdown of a Kriya, then it doesn't get a bracha. Because when it comes to Shira, we don't make a bracha on Shira. And if you accept the Brisker Rav, he has a very clear-cut proof from Rabbi Yehuda and Mishnah, because they never got a chance the third kat to finish the Hallel, and that's fine because they didn't make a bracha on the Hallel anyway. Here's where we're going to continue in the Mishnah. And basically the entire Seder Avoda, which begins with Shchita, and it's going to continue with Hafshotas Ha'or. All of this involves a violation of the Shabbos. Now, if Yudalit B'Nisan falls on any of 6 days of the week, then we don't need our Mishnah. There's no violation of Malacha. But if the 14th of Nisan happens to be a Shabbos, I think somebody told me that this year it's a Shabbos. I'm not sure. Anyway, if Erev Pesach is on Shabbos, then you're going to have to apply the principle of Doche Shabbos, that Korban Pesach, like a Korban Tzibur, overrides the Shabbos. And therefore, Kimaseu b'chol kach maseu b'Shabbos. So the entire Seder HaKrova overrides the Shabbos. Now, back in the day, in the Beis Hamikdash, the Kohanim were very meticulous about cleaning up the Azara, especially at the end of the day, and there's dam all over the place, and they would sweep up the floor of the Azara. And the question is, are you allowed to do that on Shabbos of Erev Pesach? I mean, you could really ask this question on any Shabbos, but on Erev Pesach, there's more of an issue because there's a lot of dam, as a result of the massive myriads of Karbanos Pesach that were brought. So the Kohanim took their own initiative and they cleaned up the floor of the Azara. HaKohanim medichem es Azara, and this statement is open with the word Ella. Ella means that somebody is overstepping his bounds, meaning in between the words Kimaseu b'Shabbos kach maseu b'chol, we add the word Kimaseu b'chol kach maseu b'Shabbos, we add the word Avol. Avol eno mechabed es hazor. He's not allowed to do an act of kibud hazara, which is called hadacha, and we'll see exactly why, what malacha might be involved. But that doesn't override the Shabbos. And here the Mishnah says Ella. Ella means that even though we're beyond the parameters of overriding the Shabbos, the Kohanim took the initiative, medichem es hazara, shalo b'ratzon chacham. In other words, according to the strict halacha, it's also to meiniach on Shabbos, even in the Beis Hamikdash. Now, let's assume, if you would grant me the license to assume so, that hadacha is a gzera d'Rabbanan. That has to do with hashvas gumos, that in certain cases, once you start cleaning the floor, and the floor is made of stone, you might be tempted, if there are any crevices, to flatten out the crevices. That has to do with Melechas Bona, which is, of course, one of the 39 Melechas. However, Rabbosai, why did the Kohen do such a thing? Why would they violate Gzera d'Rabbanan, which is not Docha Shabbos, for the sake of the cleanliness and the covet of the Azara? I can empathize with them. I mean, this is what they did every day of the year, and how much more so on Erev Pesach. But Kohanim are meant to be very pious individuals. They don't override Gzera when there's no Docha Shabbos. So it's Gzera Shabbos. What's the obvious answer, especially if you were with me from the Tzech Erevin? Ein Shvus b'Migdash. That although in general outside of the Beis Hamikdash we're afraid, Gzera, that if we allow him to do the hadacha, he might come to Ashvas Gumos, that doesn't apply in the Beis Hamikdash. So we can really understand full well why the Kohanim would have taken the initiative to do the hadacha on Shabbos, because Ein Shvus b'Migdash. We're not dealing with a violation of Meleches Shabbos. And now we throw the ball back into the court of the Chachamim, and it says in the Mishnah Shalo Baratzon Chachamim. I understand why the Kohanim sort of felt like the bosses, the Balabatim. They control what goes on in the Beis Hamikdash. They are the ones who do the avodah, and they want a certain level of standard of cleanliness in the Azara. And it's sort of, laissez-faire. Let the Kohanim do what they have to do and what they think they have to do. But the Chachamim were not happy with it. So in the note here, he says you're going to have to wait to see the sugya. And the Mishnah itself doesn't clarify why the Chachamim were not willing to apply the principle of Ein Shvus B'Migdash. Now, I have a note here in which he quotes a Rambam, not the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, but rather the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos on our Mishnah. And the Rambam writes that Masha Omar Maseu B'chol Kach Maseu B'Shabbos Musav Al Kol Masha Osu B'Korban Pesach. Meaning, Kimaseu B'chol Kach Maseu B'Shabbos formulates a halachic ruling that applies and encompasses all of those involvements in the avodah of the Korban Pesach. Ubechlal zeh hadochas hazora. Why? Says the Rama, B'chol yom chol, on every weekday in the year, li'achar hashlomas hakravoso, hayu maidichim es hazora. There was hadoch of the Azora as part of the daily routine or chores of the Kohanim to keep the Azora spiffy and clean. And therefore, the words Kimaseu B'chol, says the Rambam, refer to Hadocha as well. Because Kimaseu B'chol means whatever they did at all in the context of the Korban Pesach during the week, meaning if 14th of Nisan fell on any day of the week, they did it even if the 14th of Nisan was on Shabbos, and that includes Hadochas HaZorah. There's the Rambam. Al kach omeres HaMishnah, shema shenogu lasos kol ma'aseh shel chol v'nogu gam b'Shabbos, including Hadochas HaZorah, hoyeshalo b'rotzon chacham. So that the Kohanim accepted the principle of kechol ma'aseu b'chol kach ma'aseu b'Shabbos, and they understood that it includes everything. The Chachamim never accepted this principle of k'ma'aseu b'chol kach ma'aseu b'Shabbos, because the Chachamim, in at least one instance, differentiated between the avodah of the Kohanim on a weekday of the 14th of Nisan and the avodah of the Kohanim on if the 14th coincides with Shabbos. But the Rambam again is still not facing head on the issue of Ein Shvus B'Migdash. Why would the Chachamim be unhappy about what the Kohanim did every day of the week to let him do it on Shabbos? Because Ein Shvus B'Migdash is no violation of a Doraisa. And one is tempted to assume, and again, we'll have to see the Gemara to clarify this, that the Isur of Hadocha is not a Gzeira. It may have been enacted because of protection from Hashvas Gumos, but it's upgraded to a new status. It's not just your Shvus uniform, but rather it is considered, midrabanan at least, a malacha of binyan, of really improving the karka for binyan. And that means that Ein Shvus B'Migdash will not always apply straight across the board, but rather there may be two different categories of Shvus, and they're fundamentally different one from the other. And I rely here a lot on Rabbi Kivega. Rabbi Kivega says that if a person is a mumar, l'Shabbos. The Gemara says in Chulin, Mumar l'Shabbos is a Mumar called Tarku that has tremendous ramifications. Says Rabbi Kivega that applies to the Rabbanans as well. You can have a person who observes Shabbos from his goodwill as far as all the Doraisas are concerned, all 39 malachas, but when it comes to Shmusim and the Rabbanans, he's not impressed. If he violates the Rabbanans consistently, he becomes a Mumar L'chil Shabbos Midrabbanan, again with tremendous repercussions. However, says Rabbi Kivegi, that only applies to an upgraded Shvus, which is not just the Gzera, but has the status Midrabbanan of a Malacha, of violating and desecrating the Shabbos. So we see already in Rabbi Kivegi that with regard to the law of Mumar, there may be two distinctly, fundamentally different categories of Shvusim with regard to the Drabbanans of Shabbos. Okay, now we're finished with the Zrika, and we're up to Hafshatas Ha'or. Now, one dimension of Hafshatas Ha'or is to remove the emurim from the animal in order to be maktir the emurim on the mizbeach. Good. But the problem is that, I just realized that I skipped. I apologize. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kos Hayimamale Midam HaTaroves V'Zarko Zricha Achas Al Mizbeach V'Lo Hodu Lo Chacham. Again, this is a sugya that we'll have to get to Mirz Hashem in the Gemara. But Rabbi Yehuda advocated collecting any dam that during the course of the day of the 14th had collected on the Ritzvah, to collect that all and do one common zrika. Again, when I say common, it means that this dam that he's collecting at the end of the day comes from various different karbanos Pesach. Each carbon needs its own zrika. And yet, Rabbi Yehuda insists that there's going to be a common zrika of dam that comes from many different karbanos. Again, once each carbon, each lamb had its own zrika, but there'll be a common zrika, and the Chachamim disagree. The Chachamim, and we'll see the sugya later, did not accept a zrika of tarovis adam when that tarovis represents different karbanos. Okay. Now, what happens, I started asking this question, but I never got a chance to finish it, with Hafshatas Ha'or on Pesach. I'm sorry, on Erev Pesach Shechalios B'Shabbos. So here we have Machlokes Tanoim in the Gemara at the end of Masechet Shabbos, and our Mishnah doesn't even make reference to that Machlokes. One opinion is that only do the hafshata that's absolutely necessary, which is called adachazah. In other words, you expose the innards of the animal to such an extent that you can remove the emurim and be makayim the mitzvah of haktaras emurim. No need to go beyond that. And the other Tana says, no, we'll do the hafshata the way it's meant to be, mitzvah in a muvchar, the way it's meant to be a separate entity and a mitzvah of hafshata, even beyond the chaz. And this depends on what's called hutra and dechuya. So for that, you have to come to my Yom Mashiach tonight. No, tonight actually we're not going to cover that sugi because we did that last week, of hutra and dechuya. If I hold hutra, then for the sake of the mitzvah of a murim, I'm allowed to do the afshata. I can already do it, the full 9 yards. I don't have to be inhibited about it. That's called hutra. If you hold the chuya, it means do what's absolutely necessary. That the hafshata is docha Shabbos, in order to get out the imurim, do that part of the hafshata, which is arachaza, that will allow and facilitate getting the imurim. But beyond that, it's the chuya, and there's no kiyum of hafshata to be docha Shabbos beyond the absolutely necessary hafshata to take out the imurim. Ketzad Tolid. Let's understand what's going on now. We are beyond Zrikas Hadam, and we have the lamb itself after the Zrika that needs Hafshata. Where is that lamb? It's going to take X number of minutes until we're ready for the Hafshata. And how much more so on Erev Pesach when there's a whole line of karbanos, one after the other, like an assembly line. We need a place for the lamb itself, the basar hakarban, after which we'll be ready for the hafshata and then the climax, the haktorah seimud. So that's called tolid. Now, there's a dimension here which I can't explain, and that has to do with kavod carbon. I mean, this is kudshim, and we have to treat kudshim with a great deal of respect. I would have hoped, before I saw the Mishnah, that there may have been better methods of paying homage and awe and respect for the carbon than the way we have it here in that Mishnah. I could think, out of the box of many, many different ways of keeping the carbon around and storing it, so to speak, until we're ready for the hafshot. So that, I'm admitting, is my problem. He says, Unkalios shel barzel hayu kvuim baksolim ube'amud. There are hooks, and the top of the hook is curved, and these hooks are made of metal, and they were established kavua. They were actually knocked in with nails into the koslei hazara, the walls of the hazara, and ba'amudim. Now the amudim reflect on an area within the hazara which is called the Beis HaMitbachayim, and that's where the unkalios were kvuim. Bahem tolin, there they would hang up the Korban Pesach on these hooks. Umafshita. And then it was time to do the afshat. Now on Erev Pesach, when you have a massive amount of people, to each one bring his Korban Pesach, is called Misha Ein Lo Makom Litlos. What do we do if all the hooks are taken? Ula hafshit, so he needs more unkalios than they actually have. Is then maklos dakim vechalokim hoisham. There were poles that were stripped of their bark, like the bark of a tree, right? And they were thinned out, very smooth. And Chayusham, they were located in the Azara. Meiniach al Ksefo ve'al Kosef Chavero. I don't know if anyone has finished their course as a tour guide, but you remember if you get a license to drive those, those long taxis, you'll see on the outside the echkolos, the meraglim, they were carrying it on there. That's exactly what we're talking about here, not about grapes, but we're talking about the actual lamb of the Korban Pesach, and there's no place for Tliya because all the unkalios have been taken up. So what they did was they had a pole, very fancy, beautiful pole, and Reuven would turn in one direction and carry the pole on his right shoulder, and Shimon on his left shoulder. Anyway, they would carry this pole between the two of them, and that's where they would attach the carbon pesach. Meniach al kseifa al kesef chavero, kosef chavero, v'tola, umafsh. Now the question is, do we allow this on Shabbos? Meaning if the 14th of Nisan is on Shabbos, and we have these, the leftover, those who could not find the hooks, and we did this trick, so to speak, of kotef al kotef, and we do that on Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Arbasar, and now we're turning to Daf Samach Daled Amud Beis, Shechalios b'Shabbos, is then we're not going to use that method. Now, the way I understand Rashi writes, "Eni yochel l'sakin hamaklos." What I can't figure out for the life of me is why they didn't do this on Erev Pesach, meaning on Erev Shabbos, right? So the 14th of Nisan is on Shabbos. You're stuck with a situation where you don't have these maklos, and Rashi says, "Eni yochel l'sakin hamaklos." Whatever activities or malachos are necessary to make these maklos function in the way that we want them to function, those malachos are also on Shabbos. Why in tarnation he couldn't prepare these maklos on Erev Shabbos, I don't know. So now we're in a situation where he has no maklos. It's asur l'sakin es maklos. What's our last our fallback position? What's our last possibility? To fulfill Tliya so that we can now fulfill Hafshata. Is them eniach yodo al kosef chavero yad chavero al kseifo v'tola umafsh. The human body itself now substitutes for the maklos. He writes here in the note that lonis bayer ketzad hoya ofen hatliya. So you've got Ruvain's arm on top of Shimon's shoulder, but how did they put the carbon pesach? And he quotes Rabbeinu Yonasan, "Shoyumenichim yerech al regel achas shel habehema." Wow, this is really a little gory. They're going to tie up the feet and the head of the animal of the pesach, or shall we say, the front legs with the hind legs. He calls it yerech shel regel achas shel behema b'toch gidei ayerech shel regel ashniya meiniach yodo shel al kosef chavero biyad chavero al ksefo v'tolu mafshet. Okay. Now crow. Okay, so we're up to the state of Hafshata. And after he does the Hafshata, then he rips it, right? He does the incision, rips it open. So he's now has the kishkis, so to speak, of the lamb. V'hotzias a murav, and he takes out the various chalovim and whatever has to be burnt on the mizbeach. Then Nisano, he takes the emurim and he gives it to the Megis, to the Magis, I should read it. Actually, Megis would be the person who does the Agasa. Magis is the Kli in which he does the Agasa. One second. Viktiron al gabi mizbech. Now, what exactly is the Mishnah trying to teach me here? And how is this different than any carbon? I mean, this Mishnah is addressing carbon Pesach. Let me just see if he says anything here in the footnote. I don't know. Not sure exactly what this line in the Mishnah is coming to teach us. If anybody wants to research that, I don't have it here in the Mesifta. He doesn't say a word. All right, now let's get back to Shabbos. So what happens to the 14th of Nisan at Shabbos? Now, after the Korban Pesach's Hakrova was complete, now you have to get the Korban Pesach home, and you have to eat it in a chabura. The problem is that again, I'm going to question this in a minute, but right now I'm going to lay down the premise that the wide streets of Yerushalayim have the status of a Rishus HaRabim. When he carries it from the Azara, which is clearly a Makom Mukaf Mechitzos, and he takes it out through Rishus HaRabim to his house, he violates the Malacha D'Oraisa of Hotzah. Now you might say, well, for the sake of the Korban Pesach, we can override the Shabbos. That's a bad mistake, because we'll override the Shabbos for the sake of Hakrovas HaPesach, but not for the sake of Tzlias HaPesach and Achilas HaPesach, meaning you have to get home and roast the lamb, but you can't carry it through Rosh Hashanah. There's no such thing as Tzlias HaPesach on Shabbos. It just doesn't exist. So the Mishnah is going to tell us, again, a very interesting sociological description here. We're going to set up separate makomos for each kat, and they'll have to wait out there until after Shabbos, which means, again, it's not a long period of time, because we're on Shabbos and we're at the end of Shabbos, and we've already completed our krova. Now we have to wait until Lamazogan Tzeis HaKochavim. And where are the Bailim, each one who respectively owns his car, where are they hanging out? Is Yotza Kas Rishona. So the first group now finishes its Hakrova, leaves the Azara. The Yoshvalo Beharabayis. Again, this is all on Shabbos, mind you. None of this is relevant during the rest of the week. Now, the reason why the first kat is situated on the Harabayis, which is actually 500 amos square. I mean, the Harabayis is a large shetach, a large area. Now, if you go in Lifnim, meaning towards the Kodesh, from the Choma of the Harabayis, then you'll encounter a very large, tall barrier or kosel, which is called the Soreg, and that's Asora Tvachim high. Fine, he gives you a whole explanation why it's called Soreg. Soreg is a language of weaving. And what they did was they took different pieces of wood and they weaved them together to form this kosel. Now, if you go beyond the Soreg, then you get to an open area, which is 10 amos wide, and it's called the Chel. Okay, so again, the wider area, which is 500 square amos, that's called the Harabayis. From the Harabayis, moving towards the Kodesh, you get to the second area, which is called the Soreg. When you pass the Soreg, you get to the area called the Chel. Beyond that is the Ezras Nosh. So the first kat is going to position itself on the outskirts, so to speak, of these three areas, which means on the Harabayis. Now, Hatam, he writes, Shahakata Rishona Hisrachaka ad leharabayis, af shahashlishis nisheres be'azora. He says that there are two kitos that are still left behind him, and this kat is the first one to leave. And that's Asora is himtina kfar kas hashniya b'ezris noshim vashlishis bachel v'lo nosalehem el leches ad harabayis. V'chein hakat hashniya shesimo es hakrovasa lo yochla lo sheves b'ezris noshim mitzum shakat hashlishis himtina shon. So basically, we are talking about a round robin, which will allow the second cat to enter after the first cat leaves, and will lead an area for the second cat to wait in the wings until the first cat finished. And the same is true. The third cat is waiting for the second cat to evacuate, but we need a place for the third cat. So when the first cat evacuates, we're not going to give them the area that's closest to the Azara, like, for example, the Chel or the Soreg, because those areas are now occupied in quotation marks by the second and third ketos. So in a funny sort of sense, there's an upside and a downside to being in the first cat. I mean, the winning card in your deck is the fact that you'll be the first to bring your Korban Pesach. It's reason like mitzvahs. The downside is that in this case of Shabbos, we're going to have to position you all the way out there, 500 amas away on the Harabayis, because the other closer areas are being occupied by those shtei kitos that are waiting in the wings. So therefore, Shnia, when the second cat leaves the Azor, if it finishes its hakrova, is bechel, it sits in the chel, which is that area we said between the soreg and the Ezras Noshim, which is very much closer to the aliyah of the Harabayis. And then the Shlishis, Bimkomo Medis, remains in the Azora, where they did the Shchita. And the Kata Shlishis, would wait there until after Seisa Kochavim and Shabbos ended, and Mishachashecha Yotzu Lebeisa V'Tzolos Pischei. Then each one got its own Korban Pesach, packed out, you're on your way home, because it's already after Tzeisa Kochavim, Shabbos is ended, and you'll be the first to roast your Korban Pesach. Right now it's raw meat, but you'll roast it and eat it on the night of Pesach. Okay, Rabotai, this is where we're going to take a pause. In terms of the Tikkun HaMaklos, it seems that the Mechayev is Memachek, and the Tzlach asks the following question. They could have been misaking them on Erev Shabbos. Why did they wait till Shabbos? They knew exactly when Shabbos was going to fall out. And furthermore, the Gemara in Shabbos at the end of the Masechta indicates that they didn't use the Maklos on Shabbos because of the Yisur Muktzah. Has nothing to do with Meleches Memachek. And the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos here, and also the Bartanura, they explain that the reason for the Yisur of Hishtamshus B'Maklos B'Shabbos is a different Yisur, and the Yisur might be Mishum Tiltul, and the reason why these Maklos are also Tiltul, even though they were prepared on Erev Shabbos, is because they were very thin and very smooth, and it's considered a Tiltul Shalol Tzorach because there is a possibility of implementing achieving the Hafshata without using the Maklos. And therefore, if the option is that they could put one hand on top of the shoulder of the next, that's what they have to do. Now, the Yad Yamin, the right hand, would be free, right? Because he says that he put his left arm resting on the right shoulder of his friend, and that would allow his right hand to be free for the Hafshatas HaKorban. Now, he quotes here Rabbeinu Yonasan. Rabbeinu Yonasan says that they would put the yerech of regel achas shel behema betoch gidei hayerech shel regel hashniya. So they would tie together like the thigh of one leg together with the gidim that of the second thigh, the second leg. And then meniach yodo al kosef chavero viad chavero al ksefo v'tolu mafsh, meaning that they, in a sense, tucked in the leg of one of the legs of the animal into the gidim of the other leg, which kind of created a ring around, and then they could put the poste or habemis yideim, those who are in charge of hafchatas, or they could put their hands one to make it the katef of his friend, and they would insert their arm into this so-called tabas, and the behemoth was therefore suspended in between them. The Rambam in his Pirush Mishnah says that the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and they hold that you're allowed to be mishtamish on Shabbos with these maklos, and there was never a gzeir of shvus in the Migdash. Ein gozrin iser shvus b'migdash. So here the shimush of the kanim was only a violation of a shvus. We're not assuming that it was meleches memachek now. We're assuming it was tiltul muktzah, and that's mutter in the Migdash. Rabbi Eliezer on the other hand holds that since he could have done it by putting his hand on the shoulder of his friend, they weren't matir shvus b'migdash. And this is all based on the sugya at the end of Masechta Shabbos with regard to Hafshotas HaKarbo. Now, there's a machlokes in the Gemara in Shabbos between the Chachamim, Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, as far as Hafshotas are on Shabbos, Yudalit on Shabbos, according to Rabbi Shmuel, as we mentioned earlier, you're allowed to be mafshid only up to the chazeh, because that's all you need in order to take out the imurim. The Chacham say mutal hafshid es kulo. Now, as far as the prohibition of carrying the carbon out of the azara to bring it home for tzliya, and now he's violating tiltal amas b'shazarabim. The question is, does Yerushalayim have the status of a Rishus Harabim? And the Gemara had mentioned earlier in Masechta Shabbos and also in Masechta Pesachim and also in Masechta Eruvin that alsos Yerushalayim nin'olu balayla, so that the doors entering into the city in the wall of Yerushalayim were locked at night. And l'chora, you would therefore say that the status of the streets of Yerushalayim is more or less identical with that of the Azara. But the truth is that the Azara has a status of Rishus Harabim only as far as Tumah is concerned. So if you have a suffix Tumah, we're going to say suffix to Rishus Harabim, Sfeikotar, because these Rishuyos are judged in a new way as far as suffix Tumah is concerned. But as far as Tiltul B'Shabbos, we're going to consider it as a Rishus HaYochid, and you're not allowed to carry from Rishus HaYochid out to a Carmelis. And we're going to assume that the streets of Yerushalayim, since it's Dal Sosed Ulos Balayla, have the status of a Carmelis. And now we're dealing with, again, an issue of Ein Shvus B'Migdash. But nevertheless, if he's leaving the Azara and he's going outside the Azara, then we're going to say there is an Isur Shvus. But they're allowed to carry the basar of the Pesach from the Azara to the Harabayis. So this adds a whole nother dimension here. He's quoting the Meiri, that in fact, even on Shabbos itself, they would take the basar of the Pesach from the Azara out to the Harabayis. That was the first cut, if you remember. And that's because the Harabayis is Mukaf Mechitzos. And you're allowed to be metaltel from the Azor, which is Mukaf Mechitzos, out to the Harabayis, which is Mukaf Mechitzos. And again, we have to emphasize, as we did earlier, that there's no dechia of Shabbos with regard to Tzlias HaPesach. And that's why we had to organize it in a certain way that they would not violate the Shabbos with tiltul Birchus Rabim, or for that matter, in a Carmelis on Shabbos itself, and they would have to remain within the bounds of the Chomos of the Harabayas until after Shabbos. Okay, then. So Blineder tomorrow we'll pick up the Sugya Sagamora. Now we made a siyum on the Mishnah itself.